The Curious Case of Benjamin Button sees David Fincher move away from intense thrillers and into a more sentimental story of a unique man's life. Yes, it's the one about the guy who ages backwards. So let's start at the end. I'm just kidding, we'll start at the start. Welcome everyone to the Collector's Cut. I am Peter, and joining me as always is David.
Did you know I was struck by lightning 7 times?
Oh, I only knew about 6. That's surprising, actually.
Yeah.
7.
The 7th was just yesterday, actually.
Yeah. That explains how you look. Welcome, everyone, to the movie podcast. We're working our way through David Fincher's filmography. Obviously, we'll be doing his new film, The Killer, when it hits, but we are on The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. So this comes in after a bunch of things. Obviously, we did 7, we did The Game, we did that on Patreon, and then we did Fight Club, we did Panic Room, and we did Zodiac. So this is what, 6th movie? Obviously, for those eagle-eyed among you, you'll notice there was no Alien 3 in there. That's because we skipped that, because it was already on the Sci-Fi podcast, the Atomic Cinema Experiment. Go check it out. But, yes, so we're on the oddity of Fincher's filmography, the one that doesn't quite feel really like a David Fincher movie. It looks like a David Fincher movie at times, but I wouldn't say the premise or the tone feels very Finchery, so we'll get into all that as we go. The basic premise, of course, is that it's about a man who ages backwards. He's born an old man, he's played by Brad Pitt, and he gets younger as the story progresses, and it's told throughout, his entire lifespan, really. It starts in 1918 and keeps going until the early 2000s. So that is the basic gist of it. We'll start spoiler-free, of course, as we always do, and we'll get into things. So, before we say how we feel about the movie, I'll just point out that I saw it when it came out. I saw it in theaters, and this is the first time I've seen it since then. Had you seen this before?
I definitely turned it on at some point. However, just watching back the first 5 minutes of this movie, nothing seemed familiar. So it's essentially been wiped from my memory if I had actually watched anything consistent of it.
I mean, this is 2008, so this is what, 15 years ago. And I obviously remembered a couple of key moments, but to be honest, there were so many actors in this that I know quite well now that I don't think I did at the time, and did not know that Mahershala Ali was in this. I didn't know that Taraji Henson was in this. There was so many faces that have become bigger names since this that stuck out to me. But I'd forgotten most of it beyond just the broad strokes.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was a very, when it came out, it was a very widely received movie. I think it was something that kind of did hit the cultural zeitgeist a little bit. Not in that anybody really was talking about the movie itself. It was all just about the concept of it, to the point where nowadays you could just say like, oh yeah, he Benjamin Buttons, and you just know what that means. Yeah,
it just means going backwards a bit, or aging backwards, but you can kind of apply it to almost anything going back. Like if Memento had come out after Benjamin Button, people would have said the plot Benjamin Buttons.
Yeah.
People might have said
it's like,
that.
Oh yeah, it's just like Benjamin Button, on its own thing.
I guess we'll get into it. David, how did you feel about The Curious Case of Benjamin Button?
I don't really even know yet. Like, that's the thing is,
you've not even finished your sentence, and I'm just laughing because I can see the hesitation on your face, and you're struggling to answer.
It's not a bad movie, and that is not controversial. I feel like it is a very well made film, but I think that the biggest issue I have with it is that it is a philosophical art piece before it is a plot. It is something where it has this idea that it wants to ruminate on what does it mean to live? What does it mean to age? What does it mean to find love? And all these different things. And they have characters just fully spouting these philosophical viewpoints. And it's very well done. It's very well made. But each of those scenes is essentially just a vacuum within itself. And by the time you get to the next point in his life, it barely matters what he did before that. So I don't think it does a good job of really having a cohesive plot where I feel like I am watching the life of a man completely step by step, seeing how earlier actions impact his later actions and so on. But I do feel as though the movie does have a deeper overall message that it was trying to get across, and it does, for the most part, land. So how do I feel about it? It's complicated.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, and I'll give in-depth, nuanced thoughts on about every facet that I can possibly think to talk about. But I'll get the blatant, blunt statement out the way right at the get-go, is that I was extremely bored watching this 2 hours and 46-minute movie.
Yeah.
It drags on. It's overly sentimental. There's a lot of Forrest Gump in this bitch.
Yeah,
right?
But it's worse than Forrest Gump, even, because Forrest Gump at least flirted with comedy every once in a while. This is
Sure.
just harsh drama the whole way.
Sentimental drama as well. More to the point. It's so sentimental, and one of the things you said there actually clicked something else in my brain. Is you were saying how it feels all the bits are kind of individual, and yeah, obviously there's a running romantic part that's sort of a through line through it, but. Something you said clicked in my brain there. Something that another movie that I've always kind of been a little on, is Boyhood. I don't know if you're familiar with Boyhood, but yeah. Boyhood is a movie about just this young man who, from his early childhood till the age he's 18. But the gimmick of the movie is that they actually shot it in chunks every few years with the same actor as he was growing up. So when you watch the movie, it's this same actor when he's a kid, same actor when he's in his preteens and a teenager, and then as he's sort of turning into a man at the end. And my big thing with that movie is that after I saw it, I was like, well, if you take out the gimmick that it's the same kid growing up and the way they shot it, does it offer much on its own?
Right.
And I think I want to pose the same question about this movie, is that if you take out the gimmick of the main character aging backwards, which don't get me wrong, it does lend itself to all the philosophical musings about growing old and what that means. Obviously, that all comes from that. But if you take out that, and you still just have the plot of this romance that kind of is on and off again, and all the little adventures he goes on, and getting involved in the war and whatever else, does it fundamentally change the story of the movie? And I'm not sure that it does.
I agree. I think that the gimmick is within itself just there for the sake of, if we told this story straight up, and I will say it is based off of a collection of like short stories, I think, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It is based off something. It isn't just wholesale new creation. But if you take out this concept of him aging backwards, you're left with just kind of a vague life of Benjamin Button. And I say that because this movie, at least in my opinion, is extremely front-loaded. We spend a lot of time with old Benjamin Button in terms of him looking old, and it just, like, by a certain point, it's an hour into the movie, he still looks like he's 70, and I'm like, dude, just start aging backwards already. I'm sick of all this prelude and backstory here.
I mean, I get it, because that would be the hardest part of his life, and like realizing what his life is and what's happening. Because obviously he's not going to know immediately that he's aging backwards. That's something that kind of comes very gradually over time as he starts to notice, hey, I'm getting stronger. My eyesight's getting better. All these little things that he's starting to pick up on. My hair's like multiplying instead of falling out, like things like that. I think, and that's the other thing that we have a problem here, I think, with this movie, is that fundamentally you have a concept that has to rely on a lot of old age makeup for a lot of different actors, CG as well, particularly on Brad Pitt, to really try and get away with this idea that it's really him who's really old or really young, depending on which part of the movie you're at. But even a lot of the other actors, because we're going through such a span of time, you've got, actors who are in their 20s for the start of the movie, but they're still there decades later. So that you have them with the grey in the hair and some wrinkles and whatever. And just, there's something that most of the time, not always, I'm not saying there's never been good examples of it, but for the most part, when actors pretend to be old, and they put on this voice, and Brad Pitt himself is guilty of this for a lot of this movie, is they do this old person voice, and it just sounds so phony, and inherently the gimmick of the movie is taking me out of the movie, because all I'm seeing is an actor probably enjoying the fact that he's getting to do this real complex role because he's got this unique life and circumstance, but I'm still looking at an actor with some CG in his face and some makeup putting on an old man voice, and fundamentally there's just a disconnect that I'm never going to get over, where I'm like, this is just all a bit silly. Like, I get the points you're trying to make, and I get that there is these great philosophical ideas about life and death especially, like that's a running theme throughout the whole thing. I mean, you've literally created a character whose life is counting down to death. Like, unlike other people who don't know when they're going to die,
right?
He kind of has an egg timer going, where you can sort of like, oh well, once he gets to about 5, you're like, well, he's got about 5 years left, hasn't he? And then it's he's got 3 years left. He's got now he's a baby. It could be any day now.
The moment he is no longer able to grow facial hair, he's like, well, this is it, my twilight years.
It's like, shit. And obviously, there's some dramatic ironies that come out of the concept, but again, if you remove that gimmicky part of it, right, and you just look at it as, no, it's this story of this man's life and how he got involved with the war at one point and what he did in his more adventurous years, his first experiences with certain things. Like, you know, like the core parts of the story, which are about repeating the mistakes of your parents and all that stuff, like, all that still applies if you were just telling this about a regular guy who was just, you know, just someone who was orphaned and grew up in this unique location, and that was it.
I think there are two things that really need to be covered here, and that is, first and foremost, we're saying what happens if you remove this gimmick. Is it still a good story? But the movie kind of leans into the gimmick, especially in that first part, because every single time it wants to show you, like, hey, look how much effort we put into this CGI. Look how much we put into getting old Brad Pitt. And I gotta be honest, we'll get to it. It's not usually that great.
No. It varies from time to time. Obviously, as he gets close to his real age, they just sort of let it be. And it's like,
they also do, they just do makeup at a certain point. But then the second thing that I wanted to bring up in terms of what this movie really, like, what we need to focus on with it, is that when it comes time for all of the, like, middle of the movie stuff, the entire gimmick just goes out the window because he's at his age. Like, he's grown up. He's already an adult. It's the same sort of thing of, like, you have all of these major milestones in your life when you're, 5, 10, 15, such like that. But by the time you hit, like, 30, you've got maybe 2 more major milestones left in your entire life. So it doesn't matter whether you're going forward or backwards. It's just the same thing. So at that point, the gimmick's essentially gone from the movie, and it's all relying on this core romance that they've built up.
Yeah, which is kind of the point in a lot of ways, is that, it's basically just the same, and it doesn't matter. But it does kind of... It also leaves me feeling, like you say, it front loads so much, like there's so much time spent early on with these early years, and I get why, but there's times when I was looking at the clock and going, holy shit, there's 2 hours of this movie left. How is there still 2 hours left? And obviously, if I was super into it, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't be looking at the time. But I was not super into it. And part of that is the tone. Part of that is the sentimental and the the New Orleans accent doing the narration of, like, I never knew my daddy or my mama, but,
But if I did, she'd say that life is like a box of chocolates.
Yeah, I just, like, part of that's just a taste thing. And I can't really hold it against the movie too much. But it is super sentimental, and it does go through all these things. Like, it's trying to be this, I don't know, statement on existence. This tone poem of the whole thing.
I can't remember who made it. That movie Tree of Life.
Oh, it's Terrence Malick.
Terrence Malick. That's the same. It was kind of the same sort of vibe I was feeling, in terms of it just has these big grand ideas about existence as a whole, and it's just trying to put them out in terms of movie. It's just that Fincher's is far more grounded and attempts to have a plot.
That's the thing. That's why I compare it more to Forrest Gump, because it reminds me more of something like that. Because, I get what you're saying about it being this, but Terrence Malick's films are more literally just tone poems. Like, they are, like, these beautiful, serene cinematography, like, you know, Tree of Life, or any complaints anyone wants to give that movie about not having a plot, like, almost every frame of it's gorgeous, and you know, it looks better than this film does, and that's just because that's the key strength there. The whole thing's meant to be this visual poem. Here, this is still trying to operate under the guise of this is a regular movie with characters, with progression, with momentum, with all these things, and you know, you know, the idea that it's based on a series of short stories, I thought it was just one short story. If it's a series of short stories, all of a sudden, all these different sort of connected parts of the plot suddenly make sense to me.
I believe it was published over several periodicals. I could be wrong about that, but I will check on it.
You can double check that. But because you go through sections, and there was a moment in the middle of the movie where I'm like, okay, I'm in the Tilda Swinton section, and we're doing this part of the plot, and I never quite connected with anything going on. I was never really all that engrossed in it, and fundamentally, the movie just isn't for me at a certain level, and I think I have to accept that. But then, is there other things that I want to critique on top of that? There probably is.
Right. But yeah, I mean, for sure for me as well. So just checking on it, it was published in a magazine, but it was just all at once. It was one short story. So yeah, it was just one thing. But I agree with you in that it does have some issues in the story. I think for me, when I think back on my own life, I can see how different things impact each other. I can see how the period of my life that we'll say is the equivalent to the Tilda Swinton period, like whatever that may apply to, I can see how anything that would have happened there influences the decisions and the things I do even today. It's altered me. It has made an impact in my life and made me do things differently. I never got that vibe from this movie. I always felt like every single little section of his life just kind of stood on its own, and the character of Benjamin Button was essentially unchanging the whole way through. Yes, he aged back, but like mentally, he seemed like he was the same at the entire point throughout this movie.
He never really felt like he was growing. He felt like he was just this sort of blank avatar to have all these first experiences, and that was kind of it. Yeah, it never felt like he thought one thing, had his mind changed over time, and like had like a, you know, I don't want to say an arc, because there's obviously he makes some big decisions later on in the movie, but it never feels like we build up to them. It's more just he's suddenly thrust into a new situation and he has to react accordingly. But it was funny about what you were just saying there, though, about how, you know, the one portion of your life clearly impacts and like puts you on a trajectory or changes your mind about how you think about certain things or whatever it may be. Is I agree with what you're saying, but what's funny about that is that the movie does kind of try to bring up those ideas. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a whole segment where Button's narrating and he talks about all these little things around an event that basically, if any of these little things didn't happen, this thing that happened at the end of the scene wouldn't happen. But it's all very much just in that vacuum of that one incident, as opposed to his entire life should feel like that. It should feel like, no, if this woman hadn't found him and decided to care for him, then he wouldn't have been here, and he wouldn't have done this, and he wouldn't have went to that, and he would.
Yeah, that's where I kind of wanted it to feel a bit more like Forrest Gump, in that Forrest, everything he did throughout the movie had that level of, it felt like it was kind of feeding into the next thing. It felt like he did this, so therefore he ended up in this location, and it just kept going down that path. This one was the exact opposite in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I've not seen Forrest Gump in a long time, so I don't want to confidently say if I'd like it more than this. I definitely don't like it that much, but based on this viewing, I'd say Forrest Gump's got a good chance of being the one I like more.
Yeah.
just based on this alone.
Having watched Forrest Gump definitely within the past 5 years, for sure, I definitely prefer the memory of it than I did this movie less than a week ago.
So yeah, we should probably run down the cast, and I mean, we've mentioned a few of them, but obviously we get Brad Pitt as Benjamin Button. We have Cate Blanchett as Daisy, who is the main love interest over the course of the film. We have Tilda Swinton as kind of a fling, shall we say, during the film.
I would say it's the first love. That's the, like, not the childhood love that Daisy represents, but the first, like, mature relationship he was in.
Yeah. I wouldn't say first love, but I get what you're saying with that, yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we have Elias Koteas back from Zodiac and
I know.
an interesting little role. It's like a little standalone segment at the start of the movie, but we'll talk about that in spoilers, what that is exactly. Like I said, Mahershala Ali and Taraji P. Henson were both in there, which was surprising. And then, of course, you had Jared Harris popping up as an Irish tugboat man.
I enjoyed him. He was fun the whole way through.
So yeah, Jason Fleming, who I don't know as well. I've definitely seen him in things, but he plays Benjamin Button's father in this. But it is a big cast though. There's definitely a lot of other names that I'm probably not mentioning, but those seem like the prominent ones to mention. Throughout.
Yeah, I'm not recognizing anybody who's huge. We do have a framing device in this movie. Which is
it's more than the framing device because we come back to it constantly throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
Which is basically Daisy's character is, like 90 or whatever age she is. I mean, yeah, I could probably work it out, but she must be at least in her 80s, but she might be 90. But she's in a hospital bed in her last days, and she's with her adult daughter, who's, in her 40s or whatever. And she asks her adult daughter to read her this journal that she has in like a bag near the bed. And the daughter pulls it out, and it turns out to be the journal of Benjamin Button. And basically that's the device that tells us the whole movie. It's her reading from this journal, and that's his life.
Yeah. So I don't really want to get into the spoilers of it, but like, what would have really helped at any given point? Seeing him write this journal. Like, he never at any point, I don't think he ever writes in this movie, like even once on camera, yet he's got all these journals, these postcards, these incredible things that he's sent over to Daisy, and it's like, oh, maybe we should have seen that. So this framing device felt like it had some like actual real link to it.
I'm not too fussed about that. I mean, it would have maybe made sense to see him at least start writing that, because it didn't necessarily sound like it was something he was writing as he was going, because at one point he says that he'd forgotten someone's name, so it sounds like something that he's written in one big chunk.
Yeah.
Later on,
his memoirs.
Yeah, it's obvious if you've seen the movie. I don't want to spoil it, but it's obvious what point he probably wrote it all at. But, yeah. Do you know, I always remembered this being kind of the weird, like, out of place movie in Fincher's filmography, but watching it again, and because I thought I liked it more than a couple of the other films still, even though I wasn't necessarily in love with it or thought it was for me. But honestly, watching it again, I'm like, nah, Alien 3's better. I'd rather watch that again.
Wow, all right.
I'd rather watch Fight Club again, and I don't like Fight Club that much.
I mean, that's out of all the Fincher movies that I've seen, and mind you, there's a couple towards the end of his career that we have not, or I have not actually watched yet. This is the weakest for me. Not in that, again, I don't think it's a poorly made film.
No,
it's just
not at all.
So not in his wheelhouse. And I'm totally understanding of him wanting to branch out. He had this concept for it. He wanted to run for it. He spent 2 hours and 45 minutes doing it, but it just didn't work, at least in my opinion. It wasn't quite there.
No, it doesn't work for me either. And I think I don't think it's like you say, it's not the weakest made out of his movies so far necessarily. I don't even know which one I would call the weakest made necessarily, but
I mean, for me, I would probably say The Game is rivaling it, just because it feels like it had such less planning behind it.
Yeah, I mean, The Game is definitely the other one that I don't like that much, but it's about an hour shorter than this. So,
yeah, that's fair.
So if I'm watching one of them again, I'm picking The Game.
Yeah. This definitely felt to me like one, because it was 2008. It was before every single movie was 3 hours long. But we were definitely in that period of time where if you wanted to get the feeling of an epic, a huge story being told, it did have to push that limit of 3 hours. Because this was around the same time of like Dark Knight and stuff like that, pushing a little bit longer, but it was met with such critical praise and all that.
Yeah, I think one of the big things for me is I never really found myself caring or rooting for the character. I think that's a big problem with this, is that it doesn't give me a character who has these problems that he has to overcome. Instead, I mean, obviously, yeah, he has like the living day by day problems he has to overcome because he's born as an old man and he's sort of struggling with that. But it never really gives like something that he's trying to achieve all that much. I mean, other than maybe like the main romance thing, but even that's only for a small segment of the movie. There's a lot of the movie goes by where he's just kind of not caring about that, and then whatever. But it never feels like I get invested where I'm rooting for him and I care about the outcome to something. And I think this sentimental, we're reading the letters of the olden days and letting the story play out. I don't think I'm super into that as a device in general. I think it's not a big deal in other movies where I still end up liking the movie because ultimately it is just a little framing device at the start and the end. But then there's other ones where I feel like when they rely on it really heavily, there's almost this kind of like, because we're looking at the past with nostalgia and we're just going through the journey of someone's life, we're just sort of like meant to care because of that, as opposed to, no, give me stakes, give me a reason to care, and give me a reason to like think that they might not succeed in what they're doing and want them to succeed. And I never felt that with this movie. And I think movies that are like this, I probably tend to not like that much, or at the very least, like the bar is much higher for the movie to jump over to make it work for me. And so
when it's got no driving plot, no goal that the character's yearning for, you really have to say something powerful. You really have to have a message that you're clearly trying to get across, just in terms of the artistry. But like we've said, it's kind of a scattershot of philosophy as a whole. It deals with a whole bunch of different messages and never really settles down on one core. Here is how the Benjamin Button lifestyle needs to be lived.
I mean, I think I definitely like some pure art house movies that are more extreme in that sense. But I think what makes them work is that the style is so unique and so strong in the ones that I like, that sort of deconstructing what the movie's saying to me is the engaging part. It's the part that I'm into and I'm enjoying the visuals and I'm seeing what it's presenting to me. This movie is still very conventional. For everything you just said about this being this philosophical scattershot of an idea, it still just plays out like a really normal Hollywood, and I'll just say it, awards bait movie. Like it's we're going to go back to the past. We're going to talk about, it's the end of the Great War, and this is when the story starts. It still is very, very conventional in how it actually tells its story. All of the tools that it uses are all typical Hollywood 101. And as a result, if you're going to be more normal, then you have to have the more conventional driving force of a story to make me get into it.
See, you said perfectly there, of once you're done watching an art house movie, it's part of the enjoyment of it is trying to piece through what it was trying to tell you. Once I was done with this movie, I started to do that. I was like, oh, okay, what was the real overarching message that Fincher was trying to get across here? What is the point of it? And as I sat with that and I thought about it, I got more and more frustrated because I realized there really isn't one. There isn't one message that's really trying to come across here outside of, hey, ain't life kooky like that? Like, that's the gist of it for the most part.
I think there's the idea of like fearing of death, obviously, and getting old and trying to like struggle with those ideas. Like there's definitely themes. Like the movie absolutely has themes that it's playing with. But fundamentally, I think the reason why it feels like, at least to us clearly, that it doesn't have enough of a strong core idea to really like say, this is the mission statement of the movie, is because it's a movie where someone said, let's make a story, and obviously it's based on a short story, so they looked at that and said, yeah, this is a great idea, let's make this story about a person who ages backwards. And it all I can hear in my head is Ian Malcolm saying, you were too preoccupied with whether or not you could, you never stopped to wonder if you should. And that's to me, that's the movie. To me, it's like, we wanted to see if we could do this and we could pull it off. And in 2008, I remember it feeling like it was relatively convincing. It's aged a bit. There's definitely moments where you can see the uncanny valley and like the CG face, or sometimes when people are what's funny is that it's not even always Brad Pitt. Sometimes it's just the other actors in old age makeup that make me go, like this is an actor pretending to be old.
Yeah.
It's the more conventional part of it that trips it up sometimes. And fundamentally, it just makes me wonder, like, is this really a good idea for a movie? Because all I'm seeing is you constantly having to try and hide the truth. And I suppose in a lot of ways that's what movies are, but I really feel it with this because you're just constantly battling the truth of who the actors are.
I think this movie, maybe not with the exact same script, but I think this movie would have been a fantastic animated film where you don't have to worry about the actors not looking correct. You don't have to worry about the uncanny valley, as we were talking about before. And you don't have this idea of, I'm just looking at old Brad Pitt, because the character himself is just a model that changes over time. So I think animation-wise, that would have been the better way to go here. But I do think that even with that, it's not enough to fix the core problems in terms of pacing and plot with the movie as well. Because, I mean, we've mildly said it before, but I'm going to straight up here. There is no reason for this movie to be 2 hours and 46 minutes long.
No. This movie should not be over 2 hours. So right away, 46 minutes. I don't know where you cut them exactly without thinking about it, but you need to cut 46 minutes somehow.
You can cut at least 20 in the first he's old section, for sure.
Oh, dear. Do you know what's so sad is that there's a couple of good little individual moments where it even shows more style, and I kind of like, if you leaned more into this, I would have been into it, and I could have like maybe gotten something more out of like. I mean, okay, let's just say spoilers, right? I want to talk about the effectively the short film that plays near the start, which is where Elias Cate shows up, and it's a story during World War I, just before Brad Pitt's character Benjamin Button is born, right? It's in that few years before then. But it's the very same year, actually, now I'm thinking about it, because it's the end of the war. So he's this clockmaker. He's blind. He's a blind clockmaker. And he's got a wife, and they have a son, and he's sent away to war. And we see them leaving. And this is all shot in, it's got the old silent movie look to it, where there's a lot of flickering, a lot of grain. It's sepia toned, all the rest of it. They're going full hog on that sort of that mood, right? And I'm like, okay, this has got some style. I'm liking that the atmosphere this is kind of creating. And the story here is that the son dies in war. They only get his body back in a box. And the entire time he was away, the clockmaker was working on this big clock for the new train station that was being built in the city. And he finishes the clock after his son's back, his dead body's back. And when they unveil the clock at the train station, everyone's confused because it's going backwards. And he says he did that intentionally because maybe then his son and everyone else's sons who went away and died could come back. And I thought on its own as a little short film, I was like, oh, that's just a neat little short film, and it's got a nice little idea. And I almost wondered if you, like, not that I wanted it to become this thing where, like, oh, we're tracking down the mystical origins of why Benjamin Button happened, and is it tied to this clock? Was the will of this watchmaker or this clockmaker so strong that his energies, like, shot into this pregnant woman across the town, and she gave birth to a man who's going to age backwards? Like, I'm not saying I wanted that, but if you are going to compare it to something like, say, a David Lynch, and I'm looking at symbolism and stuff, like, I wanted to be thinking about this clock. I wanted to be thinking about how this is, like, thematically relevant to the story. And the truth is that for the most part, it's just the clock's eventually taken down around the same time that Benjamin Button's dying. And so it's kind of symbolic in that sense, is that he was alive as this clock was alive and whatever. But I felt like the mood and tone from this little story at the start was so nice and put me in such a good mood that
it would have been perfect, because they play it not as a story but as something that is true. It is a thing that you could go to this place and there is a clock ticking backwards. I don't know if it's actually true, but
I doubt it. I feel like people would just want it fixed.
No doubt. But that's the sort of thing where in the realm of the movie, it is this true thing that happened. I think that would have been a much better, not framing device, but just little thing that keeps coming back every once in a while. Like, this is a train station in New Orleans, and, like, Benjamin Button just keeps on going here every once in a while. We keep on seeing him kind of relating to this clock ticking backwards or something. It would have been a great just repeated notion of, hey, here's this thing that he can relate to. Instead, the one we got, which we'll get to much later, is hummingbirds, because they're able to fly backwards and they're the only birds that can do that. And it's nowhere near as strong as the one they had at the beginning of the movie that they just threw away.
Even just one scene where he's contemplating life or something, and he goes to the train station, and maybe Cate Blanchett comes and like sees him sitting there on a bench at the train station, says, "Why did you come here?" And maybe he says, "Because every so often I come and look at this clock because it goes backwards. Like it's the only thing on the planet that I can relate to is this stupid clock." And have him say so. I don't know, like talk about that or something. I don't know.
Have him get upset for once in his entire life.
I know. He doesn't get angry the whole movie. He doesn't really get, I mean, I guess a little sad looking, I suppose, but there's not a whole lot of emoting from the character, and I think that's something that would have been nice. I think the symbolism of the clock was quite interesting at the start, and then the movie even ends in a shot of this clock in like a warehouse after it's been taken down, still ticking backwards. And I'm just kind of like, oh, that's nice and all, but like I really wish this motif had been like a more prominent part of the movie. Because the whole worry as the movie's going on, well, particularly in the second half, once he's actually with Cate Blanchett and all that, is that she's starting to get concerned that she's getting old and that she's getting wrinkles and he's not, and it's her worry to have that. And it's like, okay, this is which actually, right, so let's rewind, right, let's go back to the start of the movie, right, before we get
the end of the movie.
Before we get ahead of ourselves, because I want to talk about just, like, I get that at the start of the movie, he's born an old man, and I think he's 12 when this happens, but he still looks like an old man. So if you take it back from, like, he's in his mid-80s when he's born, he's in his, like, mid to early 70s at the age of 12, right? And he meets Cate Blanchett's character Daisy for the first time, and she's like 8 or whatever, and he's staring at her, and the diary narration's like, oh, I saw her for the first time and she was, I don't know what the exact wording was, but it was basically implying that he was seeing a beautiful girl and it was like taking his breath away or whatever. And he's looking at her, and at this point it is Brad Pitt's voice coming out of this little old man that's talking to her, and I'm like, okay, I know that mentally he's 12 right now, but this is still Brad Pitt's voice being flirty with a little girl, and I feel really weird about it.
I was okay with it because they never went too far. They never went the route of like, oh, hey, Daisy, you want to go play doctor or something? Like, that would have been too much. It was always innocent the whole way through, even up until he left at age, like, 20 or something like that. Like, he was definitely older.
Yeah. Although it does, I didn't realize there was even that much of a gap. It wasn't until later when Cate Blanchett points out their age difference of about 4 years, where I went, wait a minute, so she was like
6
8?
years. Yeah, 6 years.
She was like 6 when you were eyeing her up? That's even weirder, dude.
It was 1930s, man. Times were different.
Yeah, because there's a moment where like he's hanging out with her in like a den at night, and like the grandmother,
it's a blanket fort.
Yeah, the grandmother comes down and grabs her. You're a young girl. You shouldn't be wandering about. And then she turns to young Benjamin Button. It goes, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Basically, call him a pedophile. Like, you're a pervert. Yeah. You're an old pervert. And it's like, look.
See, but here's the thing.
But if you're going to raise this topic, if you're going to raise this question, then I feel like we have to do more with it than just this single moment.
Yes, see, that's what I'm saying. Like, I like that moment because it's one of the few times where they actually take a second and say, here is a problem this character would face due to the way that his life works. And everything else that goes on, not everything, but most everything else, is just general life problems that everyone has. Like, he needs to find job. He needs to go out and explore. He needs to, like, find love, get married, stuff like that. These are just general life problems. This is one of the few times where there's something specific to him reversing in age that is a problem just to him. Yeah. And it's an interesting concept. Obviously, play with it more as he's getting older / younger, depending on your perspective. But it is this thing, the people that he is mentally the same age as
at least for a good part of his life, are going to be much younger. And it's not until he's in, middle aged, about the age of 40, where he's actually going to be around the same age as a potential partner, assuming that they're roughly the same age, mentally as he is. That is an interesting concept. And it comes up a bit in the middle of the movie when he's actually with Cate Blanchett and they're in a relationship. But I do feel like more could have been explored here, especially since we spend so much time with his first 15 to 20 years, right?
Yeah.
As an old man. Obviously by the time he's leaving on the boat, he's more like he's in his early 60s, so he's starting to be a bit fitter. He's starting to be able to help and do some work, even if he's not the fastest or whatever at it. But we kind of just gloss over the puberty side of things,
the mental puberty.
Yeah. And that was the other thing, is that so he starts this job basically through sheer will with Jared Harris, who's this tugboat captain, and he brings him on to help clean the decks and whatever else. And he starts asking him he's like, hey, old man, because obviously very few people know that he's actually someone aging back. Obviously Henson, who plays the adopted mother character, obviously knows he's aging backwards, but Jared Harris doesn't know, and he's like, hey, old man, can you still get it up? And Brad Pitt doesn't understand. He's clearly not had this explained to him. He's not had sex education.
Yeah, he's 13 or 14 mentally here, but obviously living in the home that he did in the 20s, he's not getting that sort of talk.
Yeah, well, it'll be the 30s now, right?
Yes, true.
Yeah, right, it'll be 1932-ish about though. So
let me rephrase. His mom does not want him sleeping with anybody because it would be not okay, no matter which age he goes for.
Absolutely. But he's definitely getting to that age where you need to start telling him things, so you can understand what he should and shouldn't be doing and what maybe he will get up to or whatever, right? So it's not Jared Harris's fault. He doesn't understand that he's actually talking to a 14-year-old. But what does he do when he finds out he's not had sex? He takes him to a brothel. And Brad Pitt, old man Brad Pitt, has the time of his life with this prostitute. She is worn out. She is so tired by the time he's done.
Because the mind is willing, but the flesh is old and weak.
It's just essentially because I was questioning what age is he supposed to be right now, and I thought it was a little bit older than that. I thought it was maybe 17 or something, but then there was something in a couple of scenes time that clarified that he was only just turning a certain age, and I went, oh wait, he was 14.
I got the dates here. So 1930 is when he first meets Daisy, and he's 12 years old. Yes. And then in 1936 he leaves on the tugboat permanently. So
this is what it. Yeah, this is what
18.
It was.
Yeah.
It was the next time we see Daisy after this where I went, wait, she's only 15 here, and he's been with a prostitute the previous year. What's going on? Because I was she's still so young looking, and it's case in point, it's still not Cate Blanchett playing her. We've still got a different actress. We've got a teenage actress playing her at this point of the movie. So it's okay, all right, so. That's basically how we handle that. He's kind of just thrust into it.
Right, which, if I could just pause real quick here, because that scene where he, he's on the tugboat, he's doing all that sort of stuff, that's kind of I would say, pretty much the beginning of the second act at that point, more or less. Probably a good 45 minutes to an hour into the movie. The entire first section of this movie is basically just... people look at him weird. He's unable to do things, and he keeps on meeting old people in this retirement home that he's growing up in, and they just continuously die around him. Yeah, and that goes on for 45 minutes.
I mean, the theme of death's really thick, especially early on in the movie, because not only do you have him in a retirement home where people are dying every so often, so because they're all at the end of their lifespan, he is supposed. The doctor says he's probably going to die. He's a baby. He doesn't expect him to survive. Partly because he doesn't understand that he's aging backwards. He just thinks this baby's just completely screwed. There's a lot of things wrong with him. Right. And then obviously as well, the framing device is Daisy on her deathbed, talking to her adult daughter about this man that she knew. So the theme of being the end of the road and death and counting down to death is a big part. It's the most consistent theme throughout the entire thing. Is that.
I believe multiple characters keep on saying the idea of like, yeah, they just hold on for something. Like there's something that they have to get done, and then they just end up passing. And that comes up pretty much with every character who dies. They have them show them completing that one last thing before they end up biting it.
Yeah. So like you say, he meets someone, like there's like a guy that comes to visit the house, and he takes him for like a root beer, and the guy just like meets a woman and goes, "Oh, you can make your own way home." And like, yeah, I don't think he's ever like traveled on his own, but he's got 2 walking sticks at this point. He's struggling to get back.
Well, there's a scene even just before that where his entire life he's been confined to a wheelchair because he's a kid, he can't walk.
Of course.
And then he's brought to this evangelical church. He's brought up on stage, and the pastor casts out the demons. "Out, Beelzebub! This boy shall walk!" And he starts walking across the stage for the first time. And then, in the vein of death follows this man everywhere he goes, the pastor ends up dying on stage after he gets Benjamin to walk.
Honestly, this was pretty silly. Like,
yeah.
If I'm to look at a specific scene here and say some of this is a bit ridiculous and kind of like on the nose, this is a scene that sticks out in my mind as being, okay, this is just kind of laughable. I don't know.
And yet this is the one scene that every time I thought of this movie before watching it, this is the scene that I pictured. Maybe it's like the one scene I caught when I was actually turning it on to watch it. But the scene where he's getting up out of the wheelchair and walking it's a powerful image. It's something that sticks with you, but it is, in the sense of the larger scene, extremely silly.
Yeah. The only scene that I really remembered specifically was really near the end of the movie, when he comes to see Cate Blanchett again after he's like de-aged a lot and he's like 20 now, or maybe even a teenager. I remembered that because he's in shadow at first, then he walks forward, then she realizes who it is. Yeah, so
oh, God. I have words for that scene when we get there, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we're not going to talk about every scene because, like, as we've said, 2 hours and 45 minutes long.
Yeah. We're already an hour in to the movie at this point. And trust me, you're not missing much.
You're really not. Because obviously it goes back to, like, the framing device every so often, and it's like, obviously as the movie's going on, you're like, okay, we all know that this is going to turn out to be Ben's daughter, right? We all know that's where it's going. And at one point, even this woman, Caroline's her name, says, "Mom, did Dad know about this Benjamin Button character?" She's like, yeah, I met him after him a bit later. I was like, okay,
he knew enough.
This is building up. This is building up to the "he's your dad" reveal. All right.
And also, I guess worth mentioning at this point is in the framing device, there's also this thing that keeps coming up of there's a hurricane coming up the coast. I guess it's supposed to be Katrina, and because they're in a hospital, they keep on saying like, "Oh no, we need to move you. We're moving everybody because the hurricane's coming," and then they just don't, and she ends up dying as the hurricane hits. I'm missing the theming for that. That one completely eludes me. I don't understand why it was so important that she dies in this storm, more or less.
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking about it before. Now you've got me pondering.
Yeah.
I think, well, you see the bird as well at the end in the storm.
Oh, that's right. There's that bird there.
You see that bird at the very end, and I don't know, this idea that we're all living through a storm. We're all fighting against the current. I don't know.
Wow, that's really dumb. Okay.
And the storm's finally come for her. She's finally too weak to fight against the storm. Yeah. I don't know. That's all I've got for you.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, back to where we were at. He joins the tugboat company permanently.
Yes. He ends up leaving to go and do that, and travels around the world. This is where Jared Harris talks about the bird and what why he's got it tattooed on his body, because the only bird that can fly backwards. All that stuff, but we get it's relatively quickly because he gets to the point where he's maybe in his like late 50s, early 60s in terms of physical body, and this is where, whilst they're working, wherever it is, I can't even remember. It was just
some job. They basically work as contractors on a tugboat. Of anytime there's a broken down ship, they just go out, pick it up, and bring it back to port.
Yeah. But they're stationed somewhere, so he's living at a hotel, and
Murmansk in Russia, I believe.
oh, there you go. So this is where he meets Tilda Swinton's character. Her husband is like secretary of something. He's there on political business. And she is kind of this drunken woman who catches Brad Pitt's eye, and they end up basically going through this rhythm of late at night when everyone else is asleep, they go down into the lobby and somehow are allowed to just go into the kitchen and make tea. I thought that was a bit weird, but okay, whatever. And they just sort of talk and get to know each other, and it gets to the point where she's basically saying, yeah, we're probably about to have an affair, but here's the rules if we do have an affair. And sure enough, they have this kind of fling where each night, it starts off with them still just being in their pajamas each night, but eventually, she starts getting more dressed up for it, so then he starts getting more dressed up for it, and they have these romantic evenings of dining and sex and whatever else, and then one day she just disappears. Like, she goes off with her husband, and that's the end of it. Yeah. It's the whole thing.
So I do want to, at this point, I will point out specific ages here. Benjamin Button, over the course of his entire life, was 85 when he died. So whatever math you do, you take 85 minus that amount, and that's how much he was looking for. So at this point in the movie, it's 1941. He's 23 years old. And so he is, I believe, looking like he's 62. I think that's how that comes out.
That's the early 60s. That sounds about right,
yeah, that's fair. There's one scene that's kind of in the middle here that threw me for a loop. Maybe I just missed it, or maybe I was looking at it wrong. There's a scene where they show kind of a linking footage, because we go from 1936 to 1941 between these two scenes, and they just show a shot of Benjamin Button on like the bow of this ship in a storm as the captain's calling down to him saying, oh, hey, batten down the hatches or whatever. And he turns around to face the camera, and I swear to God, it was just a completely different actor. Like, it wasn't Brad Pitt in makeup, it wasn't Brad Pitt CGI, it wasn't Brad Pitt just by himself. It was just a totally different dude for just that one shot. Am I crazy? Did you notice this?
I did not notice this, no.
Because I was looking, I was like, why in the hell would they just have one shot of a different dude? Maybe it was just, the CGI was just really off on that scene or something, but it threw me for a loop.
I've got a funny feeling it's because there was so much water and stuff like blowing across the face and screen. That was probably like making it difficult to do, so you ended up with a bit of a mush.
It was also the only scene where he ever spoke in anything above that graveled whisper that he has, so it didn't sound like him either.
Yeah, honestly, one of the things that really, probably the most stupid he ever looked. Not necessarily he definitely looked worse from a realism point of view, but there was a certain point where he was a little bit younger, and they started just giving him this sort of more shaggy grey wig, and I thought that looked a bit sillier. It was like, oh, it's like you're letting the hair do a lot of the talking here, as opposed to doing too much to his face, and it just looked a bit silly. But
see, I do actually like the idea of that shaggy wig, though, because he's going through his 20s. He had his entire beginning of his life where he was unable to grow hair. So then as soon as he's able to grow hair, he's like, I'm never cutting it again. It's going to grow out down to my ass, man.
So it's right after the end of this romance, and he's been sending postcards to Daisy this whole time, who's been getting into ballet, and she's been auditioning. Yes. She's like sort of rising up those ranks, and she's by the time the Second World War's done, she's like a professional dancer, but like she's on her path to that at this point. But obviously when he says, hey, I've fallen in love with a woman, that kind of bums her out, which is kind of funny, because like, to you, he's been this really old man, like every time you've seen him, like the youngest you've seen him was like in his early 70s, I think, at this point, maybe late 60s.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's fine, whatever. Which leads us to, once Tilda Swinton just vanishes, right? So leaves him a note, it turns out, but she just vanishes basically one night, she's just not there. That's when Pearl Harbor happens, and it turns out the boat is being drafted in to not fight, but help sort of like, any ship that gets hit that has like men stranded, they're there to go in and like bring in the wreckage and bring in the people, basically just be a support vessel. And Benjamin Button's like, yep, I'm into it. Let's go do it. And basically, this is actually a very quick bit of the movie, but it's ultimately just, for most of the war, he didn't see a lot of action until one night they actually saw a bit of action, which is...
They sailed into a recently finished battle, and then as they are approaching, a U-boat comes up out of the water.
Yes.
And they're like, uh-oh, we're going to have to deal with this now.
And Jared Harris gets killed, as do some of the other people on the boat.
I remember now, this is the point where I took my break. This is the point where I was okay, I need to stop. It was just before the action scene started. And I went out and I talked to my girlfriend. And I was like, so how are you feeling about the movie? She's like, it's really boring. I want them to like do something. And then we came back, pressed play, and then all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. Guns are firing, and I'm like, is this enough?
Yeah, it's very short-lived though, because it's over in a flash, and it's you know it obviously Bunton survives. You know, he has to watch his friend die. You know, he's captain.
By the way, there's a crew of like 4 other people that they took the time to give names and characters to, and then just killed half of them and forgot the rest.
Yeah, one's quiet, one's upset, one gives him money to give to his wife.
There's 3 more minutes you could cut right there. That whole thing.
Yeah, not a lot comes from it. Yeah, so then he goes home, and obviously everyone's surprised to what he looks like now, because now he's like in his 50s by the end of the war, right? Mid-50s even. So it's like, okay, he's starting to look a bit more spry, he's looking a bit more healthy, whatever. And Cate Blanchett shows up, and they kind of reconnect. And one of the first things she says, like, oh, so that whole romance you said you had before you stopped writing to me, how did that go? He's like, oh, yeah, it didn't last. And she's like, oh, that's a shame. So they go to dinner. And so keep in mind, at this point, he looks like he's in his mid-50s, and she is like 23.
Roundabout, yeah.
Yeah. And they go to dinner, and she starts smoking, and he says, oh, I didn't know you did that. And he's like, I'm old enough for this. I'm old enough for a lot of things. And I'm like, if you've really been thinking about banging this old man, like, throughout your, like, coming-of-age years...
I'm not going to pretend to understand how deep daddy issues run, but they run deep.
But she, like, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that she is basically gagging for it at this point in the movie.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that she said at one point she starts doing like ballet out by this lake in the moonlight, and she's like, "Yeah, you know, I hooked up with some girls that sound hot to you."
No. She doesn't say she did it, but she's like, no, ballet is all very sexual. In fact, a lot of the ballet dancers are lesbians. One of them wanted to sleep with me. Does that surprise you, Benjamin? And he's like, no, you're very pretty. I mean, I'm surprised they all don't want to sleep with you. And then she basically she kisses him and then like holds him and says, let's go back to your place, or let's go to a hotel or something. And he's like, maybe not. Yeah, like, you know, it's still like, you know, I'm still kind of old here. Like, maybe let's wait a little bit.
Yeah,
and kind of
he understands the optics of it at the very least, regardless of what he wants to do.
Which is interesting, because obviously there's a montage later on before he gets with her properly, but he's starting to be in like his, you know, early 40s or whatever, so he's starting to be kind of hot Brad Pitt. He, you know, he admits that he's, you know, he had a few sex partners in that time, and there's a really funny bit where there's like a woman doing a walk of shame because he's still living at the old folks home, and this woman's coming out putting on her heels, and there's just all these old people staring at her.
I love it. If this movie had more little beats like that, I would have enjoyed it so much more. But instead, it's like once every 45 minutes, we might get something like this.
Yeah, well, it's in the same line of thinking as the like, or the unfortunate side effects of him looking really old when he's attracted to young people is that. Yeah, that's a very situational thing, and likewise, this is a situational bit of comedy that only arises because of the status quo and the setup of the character. If you actually played with that more, then that might be something.
You know. Absolutely. If anything, this feels like a movie that's kind of, I don't want to say broken into 2 parts, because it's not, but in terms of the romance, it definitely feels like there's a period where Benjamin is too old for her, and then a period where they realize, okay, we're at the right age for each other. And it's not this gradual process. It feels like there's a very clear-cut line of, now it is okay. Now we can just move into this relationship and stop pretending like it's not going to happen. You know, I think I would have respected the movie more if they just never quite made it work, you know? Where it's just, they're 2 people living on 2 opposite sides, and maybe there was a brief moment where there was something, but it just ultimately didn't end up working out.
it's too sentimental for that to be the case. But I think to play devil's advocate here, I do think the point of that is the idea that people in relationships grow towards each other, then sometimes drift apart. And I think the idea is that the aging in both directions represents that, other than this section in the middle where they're roughly the same age for a while, there's, you know, that drifting apart happens in either end because of their differences. So they're in this case they're literally different, too different to be together before and after. But there's that period in the middle where they're a match.
There was one movie that came out, I never watched it, but I did hear a lot about it. I think it was called like The Time Traveler's Wife or something like that. And you know, it's one of those sentimental romance movies. It's essentially the same plot as this, more or less, where it's just a guy is bouncing around time and he just keeps on showing up at different points in this woman's life, and they somehow form a romance out of it. But the part that bothered me when I caught the little bit I did was the first time he shows up, he's 40, she's 6. And I'm like, that should just be a no-go from there, bro.
Yeah,
like, you're not allowed to continue that anymore.
Yeah, but is that the first time he sees her, or is this just the first time you see them together in the movie?
I don't know. That's I didn't get that deep in the movie.
To be fair, I did see this once upon a time, but I don't remember it. I don't remember it enough to know the answer to that question.
Fair enough.
So, yeah, So remind me, does anything else significant happen before he decides to go visit her at her play in New York? After he's turned her down, is there anything significant? Is this where his father shows up and talks to him?
So when he comes back in 1945, it's actually just as soon as he's done with his date with Daisy that his real father, the one, by the way, we never even said that at the beginning. We never talked about his birth, to be honest. We just kind of skipped ahead to all the other stuff. So when he was born, it was the night that World War I ended. It was November 11th, 1918, and he was born to his mother, who died in childbirth. The baby was handed over to the father, and the father sees horrible, gross, ugly man baby and proceeds to run out of the house and just leave it on the steps of this retirement home, because he can hear, like, you know, voices inside. He knows the baby will be found. And he also leaves, like, I think they said like $50, pretty much.
No, it was $18. She was very specific about it later on.
So probably $50 equivalent today, but still not a lot. But yeah, he leaves the baby and then just basically disappears from Benjamin's life. But we see throughout the movie, he keeps on stopping by the house.
Yeah,
and he never comes up. He never says anything. But he checks in on Benjamin.
He actually does.
Well, yeah, there is that one time he
does. Now that we're talking about it, when he sees him now after the war, this is where he sort of like tells him everything. He does see him once before the war, where he just sort of says, "Hey, old man, would you like to get a drink?" And kind of doesn't tell him who he is. He just kind of gets to know him a little bit. He clearly wants to know who his son is. He's sort of looking, you know, he's been longingly looking at him guilty. We've seen him in the background of a couple of scenes, you know, looking over. But this is this scene after he's turned down Cate Blanchett is where he kind of like admits who he is, because he's shown him the button factory, and he's like, buttons. He's basically saying, "Hey, like, you're going to inherit this," and Benjamin's like, "Why are you showing me all this?" He's like, "You're my son, Benjamin."
Search your feelings, you know it to be true.
Yes. Which, you know, like, all of this dealing with who his father was and that he was abandoned, and, you know, reiterating that his real mum's the one that's actually raised him and all that stuff. It's all fine, but it does kind of feel like, you know, we've paused the plot of the movie, what there is of it, to do this instead. And I get thematically why it's important, because ultimately he's going to choose to abandon his family the same way that his father abandoned him, and that's definitely a thematic point that the movie and story definitely wants to play with. Yeah. But, you know, I because maybe this just comes from not really connecting with Benjamin himself that much, but I also never really connected with his father, or or what his relationship with his father is, or cared about it.
I think that it basically ends up being a moot plot, because the original short story was written in 1922. So it wasn't set for the same period of post World War I to 2003. It was actually set just after the American Civil War to the end of World War I. So it was a different time period. So I think this is just kind of one of those carryovers that they needed to make happen, where it's like, oh yes, it's his last name is Button and he owns a button factory, and that's a thing that's carried over from the book. Because honestly, I looked through the short list of what the plot is for the short story. Nothing is the same. Absolutely goddamn nothing. There's no romance subplot. There's nothing there. The only thing that carried over is the button factory.
Well,
and it makes me feel like they did it.
The aging backwards as well, I assume.
Yes,
but yeah.
of course. But the only thing that carries over, so it makes me feel like it was more out of a sense of, well, okay, we can't figure out a good way to get this story working otherwise. I think that what the big thing was is that they didn't want you to have to sit and watch Benjamin Button working a 9-to-5 job for 50 years. You know? They had to give him some way to just be independently wealthy, and as such, he just inherits this button empire that he barely has to interact with.
Yeah, so that's the whole thing. There's a funeral. Yeah. He does something nice for him. There's a speech in the narration about, you know, not holding grudges and, like, you know, being kind and not holding on to things, but which is all fine. But it's again, it's all very in a vacuum, sentimental, and just kind of well-natured. And maybe that's partly why I never connect to the characters, that he never really has a flaw. Like,
no.
What are Benjamin Button's flaws that he has to overcome?
He shows up to New York unannounced.
He does, but
How dare he?
But even that's like this hopefully naive thing where he thinks he's going to show up and surprise her and sweep her off her feet, and then he's surprised to find, oh no, she's kind of got a boyfriend, she's got friends, she had plans for that night, and he feels kind of like a spare wheel, you know. And she, you know, she points that out, and he admits, yeah, this is my fault. I should have called ahead. This is a thing. But you know, so that leads into the next part,
the butterfly effect sequence that is actually good. I mean, I'll just straight up say, I think that this movie, by this point, we're like an hour 30 in, maybe even further. I am checked out. I am already like, okay, once we get to the point where they're able to actually be in a relationship, I might check back in here. I might be reinterested, depending on how they handle it. But at this point, there's nothing going on except this sort of will they, won't they with this relationship. And of course they will. Like, that's not even a question. So at that point, I'm checked out. But then they do this sequence where they say how all of these different factors, this man driving a taxi, this woman leaving her apartment, this guy getting a coffee, all these different things came together in the perfect storm to end up making it so that Daisy was hit by a car and her amazing ballet career that was just about to really take off fall short, and she is never going to be able to dance again. And if this was the whole movie, I'd love it so much more. It was a great little viewpoint on, oh, here's how all these different facets come together and create a life that is confusing but still ultimately the result of something. It's the thing they keep on bringing up is cause and effect. They say that over and over again, of cause and effect. I think that this would be the perfect way to show of, yeah, no, the effect happens, but sometimes the cause is unknown. You can't always see where it's coming from.
Yeah, this is a whole little mini thing that it does where Benjamin Button, because you don't find out until quite late on that it's leading to a car accident. You like when it starts, it's just like, okay, if this woman hadn't forgotten her coat, it went back in to get the coat and then answered the phone when it started ringing, she would have gotten this cab at this time instead of that time. And that cab driver, if he hadn't got a coffee, he'd have been there instead of here. And if this other person, you know, and it's all these little things, and then it all kind of builds up to reveal that this all results in her getting hit by the taxi car. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. And I get what you're saying, but I actually really disliked this in the movie. Not
really?
Not because it's bad on its own, but because it felt like we were stopping the progression to be artsy fartsy when I'm like begging for it to just move forward as quickly as possible. And instead we're like, if this movie was not as long as it is, I would have appreciated this more. But at this point, and we're like, I know we're maybe 2 hours in, right? Here, there's still like 45 minutes left, and we're doing this stuff. We're doing this overly like complex way of showing an event, and while it's handled quite well for what it is, it feels like the rest of the movie hasn't earned this particular moment, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, I get you. Like I'm fully viewing this in a vacuum. I 100% agree that in terms of how the movie is progressing, I would have loved it so much more if it had just cut this whole sequence and say, and then one day she got into a car accident. And it's like, cool, we just saved 3 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. It would save literally 3 minutes if they just sort of clipped over it. Which, you know, he goes to Paris to see her because he finds out, and she's embarrassed. She doesn't want him to see her like that, and gets kind of mean and tells him to go. And it, you know, it cuts to the framing device, and the old version is like, oh, it was so cruel, and she's like really regretting what she said. So he goes back home, and
well, apparently he stays in Paris for at least a little while and just kind of follows her around to make sure that she's actually okay. Which,
I'm just getting to the next bit.
I just love that bit because she's like, I never knew that. And I'm like, really? That never came up? At no point did it ever come up that he stayed in Paris and followed you around?
Follows. Another word for that, stalking.
Yeah. But it's the 50s. It's okay back then.
So, I think we're in the 60s now by this point.
Well, she broke her leg in 54, but then the next thing that happens is 62, where...
That's when she comes back. That's when she goes and sees him. Because he's living at the old folks' home, and she goes and sees him. And they... You know, the romance blossoms there. Because at this point, they're kind of similar ages. And it properly kicks off. And there's a great montage of them going on a boat, and they're getting an apartment and all that. I mean... Somewhere around all this is adopted mother passes away as well, and we have that mixed in. But most of it's focused on them getting together, and you know, it timestamps this as the 60s by the Beatles been on their really ugly old TV set, and just, you know, things are starting to feel a bit more modern, and they're building this life. And there's a few comments from her about her getting a couple of wrinkles, and he's getting seemingly younger.
Yeah, there's one scene that I think is really kind of just the entire last act of the movie, all said in about 30 seconds, which is they're cuddling up in bed together. There's a storm going on outside, and she's like, will you still love me when I'm old and wrinkled? And he says, will you still love me when I have acne? When I'm wetting the bed? Like, will that be a thing? And I it's a cute little scene in its own right, but honestly, it's just the entire, like, last 30 minutes of this movie. That's just it. Like, they just said it, and then they're just going to go ahead and do it again.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes this thing where she gets pregnant, and it's all this happy news at first, but he immediately starts to worry. He starts to grow concerned, and when they start talking about it, his concern is like, well, I'm going the other direction. By the time this kid is a teenager, I might be a teenager. And then as that goes on, you know, I'll be getting younger, and it'll go from there. And he's concerned. He's like, oh, you can't raise both the kid and me. And I was kind of, you know, I wanted to kind of like hold on a second. Actually, you don't have to be raised. You're going to be smaller, and you know, you might need help with certain things, but you're still going to be you. Obviously, they kind of circumvent that with him getting dementia as he becomes a kid.
He would have been fine right up until he looks 12, and then all of a sudden we would have had some issues. But
admittedly, the kid would have had a weird childhood, like watching their dad like get closer to their own age. That would have been weird, for sure. But you know, this is the part of the movie where at least I understand it probably the most in terms of what it's doing. This is just representing the fears of becoming a parent, and that you're going to fail, and that you're not going to be a good enough father, and all those things. And he gets scared and goes, right, and he repeats the sins of his own father, and in some way, you know, the cycle is repeated, all that stuff.
So real quick, can I just talk about that one scene, because it's such an awkwardly done scene, in my opinion.
What scene?
Where the scene where he leaves, he just decides it, you know, obviously it goes through a whole thing. He's like, oh yeah, no, I can't stay, I need to leave, I need to just rip off the Band-Aid, and I can't even say goodbye to them. I just have to leave. And he sells off the button factory. He gives them all of his assets. Like, he gives them enough that they can survive for the rest of their life. No problem. But then he lays the little booklet of all the little papers they'll need next to the bed. and he looks up at Cate Blanchett
and his journal.
and his journal. Yep, and she's just staring at him. She's not asleep. She's just staring at him. He locks eyes with her, still doesn't say a word, and just puts on his jacket and walks out the door. And I don't know, that for me, in this heartfelt, sentimental movie, felt like such an out of place, like a mean-spirited sort of scene.
Yeah, it's very cold.
Yeah.
I
I understand he's afraid, but like, it just, she's awake, dude. You couldn't even wait until the next night to put your master plan into action.
I mean, I think I kind of like it because it's maybe one of the few times in the whole movie I felt something, because it felt like she knew what he was doing, he knew he was caught, but did it anyway without ever saying a word. There is at least some real drama to that.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, it was like we dropped the sentimental stuff for like a moment at least. But like, you know, obviously there's a build up while she's pregnant, and like, you know, it looks bad for a second because you know he's obviously also worried that the kid's going to be like him. Like that's a concern he has as well. But she's like, no, I'll love the kid anyway. Like the kid will deserve to be loved, and you know maybe that's a bit of a theme here as well, which is a fine theme to have in your movie. I'm not going to, but it's all through this very saccharine lens, and it's hard to kind of get on board for me. So we get this montage, like his like golden age, like 20, you know, late teens to his 20s, or it's like a montage of him doing his like backpacking around the world, doing his Easy Rider and whatever else, and he does come back eventually, and you know this was set up during the like before she got pregnant, but she can't dance, but she can teach dancing, so she's now got a dance class for young girls, and that's what she's been doing, and she's still doing that when he eventually comes back, and the journal's already done, the journal stopped. But this is now Daisy saying the last parts because that's when she met him again.
And apparently also, he during his backpacking trip, he sent a bunch of letters to his daughter, like postcards to his daughter that were just never delivered. Yeah.
So she gets them all here in the book at the in the framing device. She's like, oh, this is when I was 5. This is when I was 7. Yada yada. Yep. But Brad Pitt shows up and he's all young, and now she's remarried some guy who seems fine, but it's like, okay, this is weird. Now she's like 55, you're like 20, maybe. And it's very awkward, and obviously she says you shouldn't have come, but then she shows up at his hotel room anyway, and it's like this last chance to have a fling. So she cheats on her husband with Brad Pitt when he's looking really young. This is effectively the equivalent of like a high school student having like an older mistress. Obviously, mentally it's not like that.
Right, yeah. I was going to say, if you looked at the scene, you're right, but it is...
Physically,
it
looks
two
like
old
that.
flames getting back together.
Yeah, mentally it's very different, but physically that's what it looks like and what it kind of is. Yeah. And it's like this last hurrah, and I almost wonder in the moment if that's why she came here. It's not just that she loves him and she missed him, but it's like, this really is the last shot. Like, you know, in a couple of years' time, I just can't. Like, it just won't be possible because he's going to look too young, and it's going to be entering into creepy territory.
I think at this scene he's 23, I think.
Okay.
Or he looks 23 officially. So yeah, that would have been like 5 years later, and then nothing else. And that's the other thing, is like, he's staying at a hotel. He's not sticking around.
Yeah,
he's still going off doing his world globetrotting thing, but he is here just to check back in on her, more or less.
Yeah, and obviously this is digital de-aging at this point, because now we're younger than Brad Pitt actually is, and that comes with its own share of smooth, odd qualities.
I mean, yes, but I actually like this more because we have reference footage for young Brad Pitt, so they were able to like get it to look more realistic. It just seemed weird to us because we spent the entire movie with normal/old Brad Pitt. So, but getting it here, we know, like you said, this isn't his correct age. We can tell that just by how it is.
Yeah, and he goes back at traveling, and as Daisy's like finishing up these stories, she talks about how she kind of ended up taking care of him when he was a kid, because basically he's found living in a derelict building at some point. Because I was thinking about this just before it got to it, is that eventually when he's so like young looking, like someone will have to take care of him. And obviously there's a few lines throughout the movie that compare that to what getting old is really like, where you get old enough, you have to be taken care of. He literally grows up in an old folks home, which is a place where old people are taken care of because they can't look after themselves. but no one's going to know that he needs to be taken care of other than a select few people, because most people don't get younger. So sure enough, he's found by the police in a derelict building, but he's acting out, he's getting angry, and he's forgetting things. And the doctor apparently says if he didn't know better, he would say he has dementia. And all of a sudden we're like, no, he probably does, because he's actually that age. And
so, I mean, okay, if you want to finish up the scene, because I have a lot of thoughts on this.
I mean, it's basically Cate Blanchett comes and she meets him, and he's like 12, and he doesn't really know who she is, and he doesn't never seem to really know who she is, because it skips ahead again, and he's like 5, and he's on the roof, and it's dangerous, and he keeps getting angry because he's, in the same way that a dementia patient would be getting angry because they're convinced that they're meant to have breakfast, but the person's saying, no, you already had breakfast. I think him saying F off, or you're effing liars, is the only F-bomb in the whole movie. When he's a kid.
It's also worth noting that as soon as he leaves this the ballet studio, as soon as they hook up for the last time, that's the last time we see Brad Pitt. From this point on, it's played by just child actors.
Yes. Which makes sense. It would have been really weird if they tried to digitally do Brad Pitt at 12.
I mean, they did it for old age with Tiny Old Man. They could easily go the other direction.
Yeah, I don't know. So basically, Cate Blanchett says that as he died in her arms as a baby, right, which is eventually how he was going to go out, and he looks like a relative newborn. She says that I knew in his eyes he knew who I was right before he died, and that kind of wraps up the main story of the movie.
Yeah, then we get the framing device where the hurricane hits, and
we see they've replaced the clock in the train station with a digital clock.
Okay, so these last like 5 minutes where Cate Blanchett is caring for dementia-ridden young Benjamin Button. This was so deeply unsettling for me, and I don't know why. Like, it was just, everything about it felt horrifying to me. And I think that this movie does so much of talking about death that it almost kind of just makes it normal throughout the course of the movie. It's saying like, oh yeah, we everybody dies, everybody goes out at their own time, sometimes peaceful, sometimes it's not, but like it just becomes a normal thing with how much the movie talks about it. But we're not talking about death here. We're talking about unbirth. And something about that is just so much more like terrifying on a base level to me, of like this idea of not only are you aging younger, but you also are unaware of your surroundings. It's essentially, in his final days here, he was a literal like time traveler. He was actually progressing backwards, and he was never able to see what his next day would be, Like he had no memories of the past and no memories of the future. He was essentially just stuck in the single day that he was. And maybe that's just, maybe I'm commenting less on unbirth as I am commenting on just dementia as a whole being a horrifying concept of losing your life like that. But this entire final segment, more so than anything else when they were talking about death, just deeply hit me in terms of, oh, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, the ending is pretty unsettling. There's a moment when he's still like maybe 5 or whatever age he is, where he's saying, I feel like I've had a whole life, but I can't remember it. He's saying that. And it's, there is something kind of unsettling about the whole thing.
I think there's one shot that really gets me. And I don't know why it's this one shot, but it's a shot where Benjamin Button's probably like a year, maybe 2 years old. And it's just the camera really, really far back, like almost as if it's supposed to be a entirely separate person. And it's watching the little baby Button walking with Daisy. Daisy leans down, just gives him a little kiss on the cheek, and they keep walking. And something about that, contextualized with everything else in the movie, I'm like, that's a 90-year-old man. That is a 90-year-old man you are walking with, and yet he is a child here. I don't know why. It skeeved me the wrong way, man.
It was actually funny. When she first sees him as a kid, when she comes over and she meets him at the piano when he's like 12, I actually had this weird thought. I was like, this is basically flipped from when he first met her. She's seeing someone that she's had sex with, but he's a 12-year-old boy, and that's kind of weird and icky and wrong.
See, you say that, but that's why I think I was more okay with the first part, because neither of them had been romantically intimate before that point. Both of them were these innocent, like, youths, more or less. when we get to this point, yeah, no, I can't. Like, I just imagine there being one time Daisy in desperation's like, remember when we boned Benjamin, as he's shaking a 7-year-old? Like, it's just, I don't know, it skeeves me.
I mean, like, she remembers this kid, like, pulling out and
Yeah,
blowing his load somewhere.
it's messed up, man.
It's weird. It's so weird. it, and I guess, like, part of the whole gimmick of the movie is that this is supposed to be thought-provoking to make you think about how we think about these things and contextualize them. But at the same time, I also feel like we are, like, provoking ideas into us. Like, the subject of, like, an adult and a child where there's a contextual reason why it's okay for them to have a certain type of relationship or whatever. It almost feels like, yeah, but I feel like we still shouldn't go there. It's just not healthy at a certain point.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where you have these concepts of, okay, well, in this theoretical scenario, we explore this theme, and this theme. But then you get to the natural conclusion and it takes it too far. And of course, the movie doesn't go there. The movie just, like, they stay within their boundaries. They say, no, like, you know, we're just going to look at these things. It's purely for people like you and me in the discourse afterwards, where we're exploring these things and saying, should we even be talking about this? Is this really something that should be? The one that got me was, by the time we hit the end of the movie, all I could think to myself was, what happens if Benjamin Button got appendicitis and he has his appendix removed? Does it grow back as he ages younger? If he gets a scar on his face, does that scar remain as he is a baby? Or does it heal by the next day because physically he's moving backwards?
I think he keeps a scar. And I think it's because while he's aging backwards, it's not reversing injuries. Like,
And I agree. However, the entire reason that old people's skin is like saggy and flabby and stuff like that is because of exposure to sun and time and stuff like that. It doesn't just naturally become saggy and flabby.
I think that's where just you're poking holes at the concept and the science behind it rather than. But I think the way the movie presents it, it's not like it's not like time's reversing with his body. It's more just that his body is literally somehow just going in reverse.
Right, and that's where that's what I'm talking about though. With that, we take it to a natural conclusion of we reach this point where if we follow all the steps the movie's given us, we ask these sort of questions. But the movie's not doing that. The movie stays within a very narrow window of the themes it wants to cover, and we can't blame it for not fully delving into these larger ideas that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's 2 hours and 45 minutes, and obviously the concept being a natural lead in to talk about death and how we anticipate death, how we fear death, whatever it may be, like, that is definitely there. But I feel like I have seen many other stories that handle death in more interesting ways that are more thought-provoking than just kind of this straight and I think I'd be fine with the gimmick if the tone of the film is completely different. I think the overly sentimental Forrest Gump tone is my biggest thing more than anything.
Well, I agree, but I also think that's because it's not focused on the death. It's focused on the romance, if not equal to, then more than the death.
No,
I think
that's true. It takes center stage. It does.
Yeah. Like, that's the problem. When I say it's a philosophical scattershot, I don't mean it in terms of it saying, you know, all of these big ideas about like one or two different topics. I think that it covers the ideas of death, life, love, like hundreds of different things that could each be their own movie. It decides that it needs to take a little time and say, no, here's our opinions on what fatherhood means. And it's like, what's your central message, movie? That's the point I don't quite get from it.
I mean, if I was to pick a central message, it's probably just about cherishing all the days you have, right? So while you're going forward or reverse, like the idea that all of it's equally important and all of it, you know, the adventures he goes on. I just wish I cared more about the character and actually was rooting for him to succeed in something. And I think this is just one of these types of movies where I just never get that invested, because it's just kind of like, we're going to tell the story of this man's life from start to finish, and ultimately it's all these snapshots of different times, but it's never really a case of obviously, I'm not saying this feels like this because it is very different tonally and it's very, there's a lot of differences. But a lot of what I don't like about this is the same that I don't like about a lot of biopics, where because you're just telling the story of someone's life and you're just kind of going through the bullet points, you're not necessarily, telling a story with an arc that crescendos into the right place. Obviously, some do. If you call, say, Oppenheimer a biopic, yeah, that actually does build itself around a very specific thing where it's the build up and then the regret of something. Is there's a lesson that's learned by the character overall, whereas here it's more a lot more contemplative, which again, it's fine in something that goes more full art house because you can treat it. First of all, I wouldn't expect a full on art house version to be 2 hours 45 minutes,
right?
But you can treat it in a way where if it is something that's a bit more ethereal, something that's a bit more like thought provoking because it's like making me consider what it's saying. Whereas with this, it is, like I said earlier on, it's still very much a conventional movie, and there's a lot of exposition. There's a lot of characters explaining things to us throughout. It feels more concerned about just trying to pull off the concept than it does about having like something really ironed out and like meaningful to say with what's prepared. I'm not saying it doesn't say anything, because again, there's a lot of stuff in here about life, death, love, all the usual stuff. But
yeah,
it's all kind of, I don't know, conventional.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying about it being a biopic, I agree, but I think the biggest difference, especially when we talk about something like Oppenheimer or something, is a lot of good biopics focus on someone who led a life of interesting events.
Oh, sure.
Like did something, went out and did something. This feels more like a biopic of a person who was just born with a severe physical deformity.
Well, I
just had to overcome it.
I just used Oppenheimer as a recent example, but more so because it was an example that I actually like, but that's more rare. Right. Maybe a better example for this would be something like The Theory of Everything, which is an important person, but it's,
right, but that's what I'm saying. Is that he went out and he did things. Like Theory of Everything, Hawking went out and did incredible things, and he was also disabled. This character, Benjamin Button, he essentially has this physical impairment, but he never really did anything that interesting. All of his actions he took were just the actions of a normal man living his life with this essentially deformity. Like, that's it. That's why I don't think it makes an interesting
I still
movie.
think most biopics, even of people who did important things, still fall into this trap.
I mean, probably.
Of the structure of it, the progression not quite being there in a way because they're following someone's life. I think Theory of Everything, tried to do it in a way where it kind of made the wife the protagonist, and it was kind of about her struggles being with him, and so that was their way of trying to sort of like make that work, and it worked well enough for what it was. I don't really have a desire to see it again, but that said, probably better than Benjamin Button though, if I was to make a guess based on my memory.
I
have a very frustrating time with this, and it's one of those things where tonally it didn't take me very long to realize I don't like this very much. And I realized that within maybe 15 minutes.
Yeah,
and there's
I was
lot
about there too. Yeah,
and there's a lot of movie after that 15 minutes.
Oh God, that was I was watching the movie. I was trying my best to engage with it on the level that I think it wanted me to engage with it. I was trying to, as they were bringing up these points, to sit there and just think about them, to try to say like, oh yeah, that is interesting what's bringing up. But like everything they brought up just felt so boilerplate. Like it felt like a high school student giving a philosophical essay or something like that, like a philosophy class or an ethics class essay, where it's just like, oh yeah, no, not all sailors want to be sailors. Some of them want to be tattoo artists. I'm like, so controversial movie. Good job. You really, people can be other things than what they were destined to be. Wow.
And
great.
there's more, like I feel like it's lacking personality in a lot of ways, and the few times it has personality, which is there's the short story about the clockmaker at the start, the two cutaways throughout the movie to the guy who says he gets struck by lightning, to like it cuts away to like
you say two, he does it 7 times. He lists all 7 of them.
Yeah, but it doesn't cut away 7 times. Like,
Yes, he does. All 7 times. It shows the clip of him being hit by the lightning bolt.
does it? I don't remember
It
7.
does. Yeah, I mean, it may have been 6, but I definitely counted at least 6. Because as soon as it started doing the cutaways multiple times, I'm like,
Well,
1, 2, 3.
Well, I only remember a couple of them. Fair
That's
enough.
fair.
But
Yeah.
you know, like that was at least some personality where it cut to an old timey bit of, you know, again, the silent film era footage of like this farmer being struck by lightning, and I'm like, that's personality. Like, I feel like the rest of the movie doesn't have personality. It has Oscar bait tone.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm gonna put that on Fincher because this has the same sort of tone, the same sort of visual feel as something like Zodiac, as something like Panic Room, and I think it just makes this movie more dull. I think that there's not enough of the things that make his movies interesting, the tension that he works with so well, the idea of realism.
There's no tension at all in this entire movie.
Not at all. And that's kind of what Fincher really works well in. So when you put him in this sentimental movie and you give him the same kind of lifelike / duller color palette that he usually works in, it's just overall drab. It's overall boring.
Yeah. Yeah, like I say, just those moments of personality where there's maybe a little bit of a sense of humor, like could have really taken it and turned it into more of a, not a comedy, but like something that has more of a witty take on death. You know, it could have really mixed that with what it was doing with the rest of it. And I'm not saying that's what they had to do to make it work for me. That's one choice. That's one path that I could maybe see working. As it is, I find it really just sentimental and Hollywood and just a bit trite. And you know, I just think the core concept, maybe there's a good idea in there, but I think ultimately seeing people in old age makeup, or in Brad Pitt's case CG, trying to portray different ages that they're not actually doing, because you know, some stories have to do it a little bit because they've got like one scene set later and we have to do one person who's old or whatever. It happens every so often, and it tends to be pretty confined to just one part of the movie, and they do the best, they maybe hide it a little bit, and you move on with your life, and it works for the purpose it's there. But the nature of this movie is that we have to do it with so many characters, and we have to do it with the main character so specifically over long stretches of the movie, that if you're sensitive to how kind of inherently silly some of that is, it's hard to get past it. And I had a lot of problems with it in this.
Now, let me just go ahead and throw this out here. This movie won 3 Oscars. The 3 Oscars were for Best Art Direction, Best Makeup, and Best Visual Effects.
I mean, in 2008, I can see why visual effects won, but I'm not enthused by it to look at it now, to be honest.
Yeah.
I guess fundamentally it's just not for me, but like all the things that make the movies that I like from Fincher interesting, all the aspects that make them feel like they're in his voice, none of them are here. And I'm not saying he has to keep making the same type of movie by any means, but I do think that it's all missing here.
Yeah, no, it's never a thing where we encourage a director to just stay in their wheelhouse and never explore. I'm fine with directors exploring, but you still have to know your limits. And I think going from things like Seven, Fight Club, and Panic Room to a 2-hour, 46-minute long romance film, you jumped a bit further than you actually could reach there. You needed to take maybe do a movie that is a tension movie that has a romance subplot first, just to see if you can handle that. Something like Gone Girl. That would have been fine. But instead, you just leapt over here.
I don't think I would describe that as a movie that has a romance subplot.
It at least has a relationship subplot.
It does, but I mean, romance is a bit of a stretch given the context of the premise. I mean,
that's fair.
We'll get into that when we get to Gone Girl.
Yes.
But anyway, yeah. So, yeah.
So only last thing I want to bring up here, and this is nothing to do with the movie, but everything just to do with our little show here, is that this movie was middling at best. It was a bit disappointing, and this is how we begin the second year of our show.
Is this episode 53?
This is episode 53.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I don't like Benjamin Button. I think it's a mediocre movie that, on a personal taste level, I think is like I enjoy even less than that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I have no banter against that. It's. I think that there's some nuggets buried underneath, but none of them have the ability to really shine through with the movie that we were given.
Yeah, yeah. So, sadly, we're at the rating, I guess, and I don't think it's going to be particularly enthusiastic. So, on you go, David.
10. No.
Divided
God.
by.
Yeah. God, I don't know. It's definitely not a movie I ever want to go back and watch again. Like, this is by far enough. Even if I may have gotten more out of some of the, deeper like meanings they were trying to hide in it, it's not worth 2 hours and 46 minutes. So I would have to say it's gonna be like a 4.5 for me. I really didn't enjoy like anything in this, and like I was saying briefly in there, as I came out of the movie, I was trying to play with it on the level it wanted to be. I tried to sit with it and think through the sort of philosophical implications of like, oh, what does it want to say about death and life and love and all these different things? But after half an hour of sitting there thinking on it, the only thing I could think is like, boy, the last 30 minutes really didn't work for me. Boy, those last 30 minutes are making it hard to sleep right now.
Well, the first 30 minutes, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that too. So yeah, it wasn't good. So yeah, I'm giving it 4.5.
Yeah. This is tough because part of me thinks that sounds a bit harsh because obviously on a technical level it's obviously fine, even done well at certain points, but I was never engaged really. I thought it was a slog to get through. I think like what I wouldn't expect from Fincher is what feels like hollow, boring Oscar bait, but that's kind of what it feels like. My comparisons to Forrest Gump and Boyhood, like combining those two things to have a baby that ages backwards is not my idea of a good time.
Nah.
So yeah, this one's actually really hard to rate.
It is, yeah.
So it's hard to rate.
I was telling Pete just before we recorded, I had no idea what my rating was going to be going into this because I needed to talk through it. I needed to see how I felt about it, and based off of positives and negative things said, I think 4.5 is fair for me. But it's wherever you come down, man. There's no right or wrong answer. There's just the comment section you need to deal with.
I don't care about them. All right.
Can someone download this video and just all the exasperated sighs that we make?
Okay, I'm just gonna go straight for.
Okay. I have no arguments against it. The only thing that you said in there that I would make any point against, and it's actually for the worst, is I think that this movie for 2008 was probably perfectly fine in terms of the visual effects of old Benjamin Button. I think nowadays it's so standout. Like you can, every time you see that old face mapped to that body, you can feel that it's not supposed to be there.
Oh yeah. I don't disagree with that. The effects stuck out to me as well. Yeah.
Doesn't make the cut though.
Well, obviously it doesn't.
Obviously it doesn't, but where doesn't it? I don't think it cuts deep. Like I said, I think the fact we were wrestling with it says that there's some sort of merit to it. So it's at least cut your losses. But I think I would make the argument for cut from the collection just in general. I don't think it quite is on the same level as other horrible movies. It's just so, like you said, Oscar bait, bland, and not what we really wanted from it.
Yeah, I'll agree with the cut from the collection. Lower than that feels a little too harsh, but damn, it like there's movies from lower tiers that I would probably watch again over this, and I think that's something that has to be stayed. So Yeah, I actually think this is. I think this is the worst Fincher movie, and I really don't like the game.
Yeah.
And I'm not particularly enthusiastic about Fight Club. But
I mean, I'm hard agree. I did say when I was giving 7 my score that I thought there were better Fincher movies. But this is by far the worst. I'm comfortable saying that. The only one I haven't compared it to yet is obviously The Killer, still yet to release, and Mank. I haven't watched that one either.
Yeah, I've not seen that, yeah. So obviously we will. We'll have done that by the time we get to the end of this. We'll be back next time with Social Network. Is that next?
Yep. Social Network.
Social Network is up next, so look forward to that. The only movie that we're not doing, other than Alien 3, is Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. One day we'll do that with the other Dragon Tattoo movies. So that's the only one we're skipping as far as Fincher's filmography goes. But Social Network is up next. Of course, this is where I should tell you about the bonus shows you can go and access. So over on patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, at the $3 tier and up, you get access to the Criterion Cut every month, which is a show where we review movies from the Criterion Collection. And shockingly, Benjamin Button did technically get a Criterion Blu-ray.
Did it?
It did.
I should have been wearing my blazer. I've been doing that. I didn't even think it would have made the cut.
Yeah, that in the game, it's like the 2 Fincher movies they could get the rights to release.
That's so weird.
I know. But yeah, so, and by and large, like at least to date, all the ones we've recorded, we have been very positive in all of them. Like nothing's scored lower than an 8 on that show. So that
on
is
the show specifically, not Criterion movies apparently.
Yeah. That's the best of the best, is the Criterion Cut. And at the $5 and up tier, there's a monthly show as well, where we do the opposite of that. We do the worst of the worst. We do some of the most infamous bad movies of all time. We have done a Neil Breen movie. We have done Miami Connection. Some of them are so bad they're amazing. Some of them are just so bad that they're the torture. But that's the show. So there's the 2 bonus shows monthly that you can get over at Patreon. So go and check them out if you're interested. And that, of course, supports all the content. It supports the podcast, helps keep all of it coming. And there's bonus streams after midnight and other stuff over there too. But that is the Collector's Cut. Thank you very much for joining us. We always appreciate it. Keep watching movies, and does his libido go up as well when he's like going backwards? So like when he gets to like 14, is he just...
yeah, no, he's 4 and he's humping everything.